Greetings. My name is Louise Dente, and I welcome you to yet another edition of Cultural Caravan. On this edition is a special. We have a guest who comes a great distance to share some very important information with us. He is a Pan Africanist, a cultural scientist who has an astute and profound analysis of the pyramid of issues that affect the global African community. He received his doctorate from the University of Manchester, England, and he has been lecturing for over 20 years. His academic influences include Dr. Yosef Binyakinen, Dr. John Henry Clark, Dr. Molana Karenga, Dr. Amos Wilson, and Professor James Smalls. Dr. Kheftusa Akhiba Ankh, I hope I'm saying that correctly, offers, in his own unique style of presentation, a holistic approach to the issues that affect Africans mentally and spiritually. And he conveys his message in a comprehensible way and lectures on topics ranging from ancient African civilization to the present day. We'd like to warm welcome to our brother. Welcome to Cultural Caravan.
Thank you, Sister Louise. My name's Dr. Kheftusa Akhiba Ankh, and I'm so happy to be here. I'm very blessed to meet with you again, and I'm ready to go.
Well, right now, I know there are a lot of people in my audience who are saying, where did this brother get such a beautiful name? So could you please explain what Keftusa Akiba Ankh means?
It means joyous, the image of God, when my heart remains stable.
Wonderful. And its origin is from?
Ancient Kemet.
Yes. Just to let the audience know, Dr. Keftusa, we met each other over 30 years ago at the world famous African Poetry Theater. And at that time, you were definitely a constant pursuit of research and history. And I also had the pleasure of having you in one of my productions. We did an outdoor street festival in honor of the great um, Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey, and you played the Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey, along with other things. And certainly over the years, again, we lost contact, but it was great to recently get reconnected to you and the work you're doing all the way in London, England. And so we're going to talk about that. And also, as relates to a very important milestone, in which talks about called the Windrush Generation, which really talks about the migration of mass migration of African Caribbean men and women to London. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But let's start at the beginning. When we talk about the migration or the presence of Africans in Europe and or in particular in general, but in London or England in particular, tell us about that.
The basic thing that we need to understand is that modern research has demonstrated that the oldest Britons were actually Black, according to modern research. That over 10,000 years ago, there was a body which has been named the Cheddar Man, who was Black, dark skin with blue eyes. And so when we look at the history of England, we can see that Africans have always been in England. You also had Septimus Severus, the great Roman emperor. So we have a history replete with the movements of Africans in the Great Britain. However, that is something that we will discuss at another occasion. But needless to say, the important thing to understand is that prior to 1948, Africans were already in the UK.
You talked about the ancient presence, so that Africans, although people may say we just came, actuality, the history that was actually focused on, and this being the 75th anniversary this year of the Windrush immigration of predominantly Africans from the Caribbean, particularly Jamaica and other Caribbean countries, this being a big milestone. Can you tell us what impact do you think African Caribbean people have had since they arrived in the late 1940s en masse?
For example, my grandfather came in 1948. But he didn't. He stayed for a while, then he went back to Jamaica, and then he came back again. Now, one of the things that we need to understand very clearly is that after the Second World War, Britain was in a shambles. Britain, the economy of Britain was on the floor, so to speak, and therefore an invitation was issued to people from the Caribbean to come to England in order to work. So basically, what happened was we came here to work and we had a major impact. Now, part of the impact was that we were given particular types of jobs. Some people say that the jobs that English people didn't want, like working on the railways, working on the buses. There were many so-called lower professions, if you could call them that, at that time, that basically drew in Africans. Now, the interesting thing about it is that when we first got here on the Windrush, it was very clear that the papers were welcoming us, they loved us, so to speak, and it appeared to be a very happy combination. However, it didn't last too long, because before long, there were many problems that came about, which many of us recognize were due to race.
The Windrush generation came in between 1948 and 1971. And you had this boat with particularly the Empire Windrush being one of the first boats, among others, as you indicated, that came. What were, and again, just thinking about this influx in Britain of these Africans coming, or Africans from the Caribbean coming in, the type of treatment. Can you explain what were some of the things that your forefathers said about their what went on while they were trying to adjust to a new environment?
So the one of the first things that's really important to indicate is that when we first came here, we never came here as Africans, really. Most people from the Caribbean did not see themselves as Africans. They saw themselves as Caribbean, which I will explain at another point in time, which was slightly problematic. Not actually Caribbean, it was West Indian. All right. So the people that came here were labeled West Indians. Now, what actually happened was that, as I said, we took up the lower echelons of society. Now, it has been stated very clearly that when the first Africans arrived here, finding shelter was problematic. Over the years, what basically happened was that the men came by themselves and then they brought their families over later. So at that point, they really needed to establish their own communities. However, at that time, there was a sign, no blacks, no dogs, no Irish, which was an indication of the lack of welcome that we received. Now, my grandfather told me that when he moved to London, he was spoken to by a young Caucasian woman who asked him where his tail was. And when he told me this, I said, really? And he was for real. She really believed that he had a tail. So in many ways, the type of racialized propaganda played a major part in regard to the so-called integration of African Caribbeans into the UK society.
Now, when you think, again, your grandfather coming in 1948, you and I guess your family settled in London. How
Yes.
was it for your father and yourself growing up in London
Mm.
over the years? Had
Mm.
the conditions changed?
Wow, you're really asking me to go deep here. Now, the first thing is that I grew up just outside of London, and let's start with my mother, who came with her whole family, as opposed to my dad, who came here when he was 16 into a area called Ladbroke Grove, which is where they have carnival every year. But at that time, these were essentially white areas. So what he had to do, as he told me, was he had to navigate the racism of the young people. So, for example, he said that every Friday night, teddy boys would come around and smash their windows. So he was constantly assaulted. But as he told me, it was the bad boy them, excuse my little piece of patois, the bad boy them from Jamaica that really helped to change the circumstances, because essentially Black people were beaten up in many scenarios across England, because we didn't just come to London. We basically ended up in the major industrialized areas, and you would find one family would go to Birmingham and other families would go there because they were basically soliciting us for work.
So basically, you were victims of mob violence and so forth. So it was not an easy thing. Now, you use the term telly boy. Just so I'm clear, because I know my audience is like scratching their head. What is that? What was that?
Okay, so a teddy boy, and I never really got it because by the time I grew up, I saw a couple of them, but I didn't really understand it. So they were kind of like, remember the Elvis Presley type hair, the
Mhm,
the greased back hair.
mhm,
They were them. So they were teddy boys. They basically, you see, much of the fashion in England uh, comes from the United States. They took the style of this kind of greased back hair and rock and roll. So
mhm.
they were perceived as being highly British. This is a teenage fad. So they had real problems with African people, and they demonstrated it on a regular basis in London, in particular.
What shaped your consciousness?
Mm.
Particularly as you growing up in this environment.
So first thing is, let's deal with racism. Racism is, if you think about racism in the world, often I find that people in the UK who are considered to be English, therefore white, they often talk about race in America. However, the one thing that we need to all understand historically, that um, the first state in America was called Virginia. Okay, the first colonial area was called Virginia after the so-called Virgin Queen, Queen Elizabeth I. So what I'm basically saying is that race is a English phenomenon. It occurred in this country before it became Americanized. However, because I don't have too long to explain it, the point is that racism is endemic to the UK, the United Kingdom. So basically, what I grew up on in this country was a diet, a very poor diet of race. I remember one time I was in a shop going shopping with my mum. I was around 5, and I never forget this. This young white boy pointed at me and said, "He's black, mum." And I couldn't really understand. I didn't really understand what he was saying because everybody in my house was black. And therefore, because we didn't have a racialized consciousness, we just, everyone's black. But for him, he made a big deal out of it. And I could feel the disgust in that came out of the tone in his voice. So for me, race was a very hard pill to swallow growing up in this country.
Let's talk about the Afro-Caribbean culture in London. Tell
Mm.
me about how do people from the Caribbean who are now part of London society, have been there for centuries, how do they look at themselves? Have they become a little more conscious, not just of their connection to the Caribbean countries, but also to their Africanness?
When I was growing up, I used to hear my uncles talk about us being West Indian. That's basically how the majority of African Caribbeans refer to themselves, as West Indian. So I didn't really know that I was African. I just thought I was black. And my concept of black was negative because it had been fed to me through the thinking and the thought patterns of other people. So, however, over time, there has been this budding form of African-centered consciousness. Now, in regards to the majority of the British population now, most people would not call themselves West Indian. There is an age, there's almost like an age stamp on that. Most people wouldn't call themselves West Indian. Most people would probably call themselves Black, as they do in America as well. However, many people today would refer to themselves as African Caribbean. But like in America, it is a debate. And often what happens is the African conscious people create this mass, this thought pattern that pervades into the larger Black community, whereby people will call themselves African, but don't necessarily have a proper grounding in African history.
And as we start to make those connections, and many people's, like, we had people like the great Paul Robeson and James Baldwin and others travel the world and connect with others outside of the confines of the United States, and see that we're really one people, that regardless. And of course, the great Marcus Messiah Garvey, who went to London after he unfortunately was deported from the United States, and tried to set up a base of operations while in London in exile. Understand that wherever people of color, we still are dealing with the same things. Racism is a very prevalent and an issue that has to be dealt with, and reckoned with. The other thing is the monarchy. As you know, recently there was an African American woman by the name of Meghan Markle, who married into British aristocracy. And I was just curious about that. What was the perception of people to this woman marrying into British, the dynasty of the monarchy? I was just curious on that.
So now you're asking me some very difficult questions.
This is
I,
off the. I'm not expecting you. I'm just curious.
but I'm gonna answer though. I'm gonna answer, and I'm gonna answer truthfully. You see, the issue around the monarchy is very deep, because in the older generation of so people who consider themselves to be West Indian, there was very much a law in regards to the monarchy. Some people, or many people, connected to the British royal family. They felt like these people embodied something that we needed to be a part of. So from a generational standpoint, and of course I'm generalizing here, from a generational standpoint, you could say that the older people may have had a greater propensity in regards to relating to the royal family. However, as time has passed, you can see that there is a myriad of opinions between people in this country. So for me, Meghan Markle is very interesting. However, I've never really identified with the royal family, and most of the people that I grew up with didn't. We grew up in what happened to be an anti-British culture, because we were lost. We didn't really know who we were, but we knew that we weren't accepted. So by the time we got to our teenage years, we were about rejecting what we considered to be mainstream British culture. In many ways, you have a segment of people who do that in amongst the African American community. So in other words, what I'm saying is that you will find segments of the population who think different things. However, I would say that at the main, the monarchy is in trouble, especially with younger Black people, from my standpoint.
I know there was a question, particularly with the passing of Elizabeth II, which she was held in high regard by many, and then there were some who did not. But there was a question that was asked to the various countries in the Caribbean that were under quote unquote the British part of the British Empire as to whether they wanted to stay. When some of them, I know Barbados particularly, made it very clear that they weren't interested in staying under the monarchy, and then of course Jamaica, interestingly enough, did not come out. So there was a lot of talk, and I'm just wondering as we go further, how many nations in the Caribbean will continue to be part of the British Empire, and whether they will decide to stay as independent republics. Independent. So that's a big question, as you said. I
Yes,
didn't know
yes.
if you wanted to say anything about that.
Yeah, I do. So basically, you use the word empire. So obviously, the imperial phase of England ended. So what happened was the Caribbean islands became part of what was referred to as the Commonwealth. A beautiful, I love that term, a Commonwealth. And basically, what that was, it was the British imperialists shifting to a new way of handling power because Africans in the Caribbean were moving towards independence, they needed to keep that relationship going. So basically, they could have access to the resources. So they referred to, instead of using empire, they referred to the Commonwealth, which basically meant that we were still in the subordinate position and psychologically, materially, and even, dare I say, spiritually, many of the people in the Caribbean are still struggling with this consciousness. There is a double consciousness. The W.B. Du Bois talked about the double consciousness. All right. We have the same thing. We have a historical amnesia where we are unsure about who we are, in my view.
Interesting. And as I said, the same thing occurs here. And as you said, there's the celebration of the patriotism and which is real. And but then there's the concern about us as a people and the respect and needing equal treatment under the law. So I know that that is a constant wherever you see people of African ancestry wanting to be respected, wanting to be treated fairly, wanting to be getting equal access to opportunities. So, I really appreciate you sharing this unique history, and we look forward with other opportunities to engage you in conversations, as we said, as relates to the history of Africans in Europe in general, and of course in England in particular, as well as other common conversations. And I appreciate you joining us today, because I think this is an opportunity for us to bridge the gap, to take it internationally. And certainly yourself, being someone who I've had the pleasure of knowing, has really done some great work on that part of the world. So do you want any closing comments and thoughts as we and please tell us about some of your work as
Okay.
well, some of your written work.
Okay, so basically, I'm now an independent African-centered scholar. So I have written a book called Heru Rising and the Wisdom of the Shepsu, which will be coming out shortly. Okay, I'm also working on another piece of work, which is called The Winds of Napata, which will look at it's a fictional account of an ancient Kemetic environment, so to speak. It's really exciting, and I'm not going to say too much about it, but I just put it out there. So basically, I just wanted to address something that you stated because I lost it a little bit in my response. You asked what impact did Africans have in this country? We've had a major impact. One, according to most Caribbean people that I've spoken to, when we got here, British people did not buy houses. Uh-oh. So what African Caribbean people did, and I'm talking mainly about working class British people, what we actually did was begin to buy houses. My granddad, when he came to London, he bought a motor car. And because when they first arrived here, people were still walking horses and stuff like that. But he bought a motor car, and he told me about how some of the English people responded to that. Wasn't very nice. So we brought many a change to this country in terms of our food, our music, and our attitude. In many ways, we brought a light, we brought color, we brought the spirit of African people to this country. We injected it into the heart and soul of this country. If African Caribbean people never came here, then this country would never be the same. So what I want to say is that I'm grateful to those of the Windrush generation who came here and fought hard. They also fought for laws that changed the very racial dynamics within this country, because most of the people never ended up in universities. I did, because of the work of my ancestors. So I really want to thank all of the original people who came here, who fought, who laughed, who cried, but were still here. And they are still here because whenever we speak their names, we remind ourselves through African culture that they still live inside of us, outside of us, and they will live on forever as long as we call their beautiful Black names.
Absolutely right. And certainly this year, 2023, marks the 75th anniversary of the Windrush generation. And I think one of the oldest surviving people is 98 years old. So there was a big celebration in England, in London. And certainly we want people to know on this side of the globe, because there's lots of Africans from the Caribbean who are here in the United States and in New York particular, who may have family members back in London and England and need to be aware of what's happening. And we are one big family. So I think it's so important that we are aware of the achievements of our people wherever we are in the globe. And I appreciate you helping us to bridge the gap. And we look forward to have opportunities for you to come back and talk about your wonderful book and some of the history that we're still sharing amongst our community. But I just want to take this opportunity to sincerely thank you, brother, for being on the show. And we look forward to seeing you again.
Thank you, my beloved sister. And I'd like to thank you personally for being a wonderful advocate of Africa and just being a beautiful Black woman. Thank you.
Well, I hope you've enjoyed this broadcast, and we continue to encourage you to tune in, to write, and to tell a friend. And please visit our website at www.ccptv.org. But until next time, Louise Dente saying thank you.